In France, during the late 1950s, a new generation of young people was arising who were immersed in film journals and were regular goers of cine clubs and art SA, or art and experiment cinemas. This new generation was the first to have a clear awareness of the entire history of cinema, and they were dubbed as the Nouvelle Vague, or the French New Wave. Passionate about le cinéma, a group of these young people started out as critics for the influential film journal Cahiers du Cinéma in the 1950s. Figures like Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, Claude Chabrol, Eric Rohmer, and Jacques Rivette successfully transitioned from film criticism to film production, making their original feature debuts in the late 1950s and early 60s, as the government started financing their projects due to old-style movies becoming less and less popular, which led to a decline of cinema attendees after 1958. Arguably, also part of the Nouvelle Vague, older and less cineast individuals from the rive gauche, or left bank, such as Alain Resnais, Agnès Varda, and Georges Franju also made their mark in the French New Wave, with breakthroughs and chefs-d'œuvre, such as Alain Resnais's Hiroshima Mon Amour, as well as his L'année dernière à Marienbad, and Georges Franju's Les yeux sans visage from 1960. The French New Wave was known for its innovations in filmmaking techniques, as well as in narrative. The most dominant narrative techniques of the French New Wave cinema were multiple presentations of events, a self-referential style and reflexivity, open-ended narratives, and leisure-class lifestyle stories. The Nouvelle Vague's most distinctive stylistic features were the plan séquence, or the long take, and discontinuous editing and economic filming such as recording on the streets. Cleo, from 5 to 7, by Agnès Varda from 1962, is an unusual picture that covers 95 minutes in the life of a Parisian actress awaiting the results of a critical medical test. This film, although being a rive gauche, or left bank picture, consists of many new wave stylistic and narrative features. The first distinctive narrative feature of French New Wave cinema was the style in which the author presented the film's events. Directors of the Nouvelle Vague combined objective realism, subjective realism, and authorial commentary in their works. In order to analyze how Varda uses this narrative technique in Cleo, one must first understand the structure and plot of the film itself. Cleo's narrative structure consists of 13 chapters marked by time of day, having the film span from 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. Throughout these chapters, Cleo's character develops from childhood to maturity, starting from constructing her star image by singing the lyrics of songs written for her,
comme une île déserte que recouvre la mer. Mes plages se dévident sans toi, sans toi.
Then Cleo transitions into a phase of contemplative silence through listening to others, developed through the handheld street scenes shooting style, and finally into the acquisition of a speaking voice, with which she becomes confident in revealing her internal anxiety of cancer to Antoine in the film's final chapter. Varda, sticking to the narrative technique of the Nouvelle Vague, presents the simple yet touching plot through objective and subjective realism, as well as through authorial commentary. The narrative form of objective realism was prevalent in post-war European art films, and it refers to a form in which the plot of a film consisted of chance events that often could not be incorporated into a linear cause and effect storyline, as the events of those films happen randomly and without the subjective point of view and control of the protagonist. Objective realism is evident in Cleo, as the film depicts a Parisian woman's frolic through Paris over a period of 1.5 hours, inviting anything to interact with her along the way, thus being documentary-like. Along with objective realism, With the film focusing on the day of a specific character, Cleo, Varda is obliged to incorporate at least a selected amount of narrative subjectivity to the film as well. Subjective realism, being a representation of events presented through a particular eye, most commonly through that of a specific characters in a film, is represented in Cleo through symbolism. When Cleo is walking through a busy city square, she observes a performance going on, being a man eating frogs and then regurgitating them. This is symbolic because we already had a glimpse of Cleo's ring representing a frog and a pearl. The pearl represents Cleo's beauty, being what shelters her from her death. As in the beginning of the film, she says, "Being ugly, that's death. As long as I'm beautiful, I am alive, and 10 times more than others." However, after Cleo looks in the mirror and is unable to read her own fear in it, she realizes she is both pearl and frog. In essence, after seeing the man swallowing frogs, Varda manipulates that realism into subjectivity, as that image reminds Cleo of the frog in her stomach, her cancer, and due to no longer being able to read her own fear, Cleo realizes that she is, although still beautiful, is at the same time a frog, because she will die from her cancer, thus being ugly, as death is ugliness, according to her. Cleo then sees a man having his bicep pierced all the way through with a spear, as well as later, a prematurely born baby being carried in an incubator. These two visceral scenes, along with the frog scene, also develops the film's subjective realism as the nauseating and repellent act of piercing one's biceps, as well as swallowing frogs, along with the poor sight of a premature baby with its ambiguous future ahead of it, reflects the emotions that Cleo feels herself, being her own ambiguous future due to the uncertainty of her medical results, as well as the nauseating fear of them. The third narrative style in which Agnès Varda presents the events of Cleo is through authorial commentary, being the auteur's contribution to the film, bringing his or her own meaning to the picture. This is evident in all 3 of the subjective realism examples I just gave, as due to having created meaning through images of frog swallowing and premature infants towards the subjective point of view of the film's main character, Cleo, one realizes that this is also authorial commentary, as Varda herself is making the audience understand Cleo's internal feelings through these images. Thus, Varda makes her own mark and commentary on the film's meaning. The other example of authorial commentary is all the references to the social and political context in which the film was set. Throughout the picture, Varda fits in 3 slightly obscure references to the actual time period of 1961, in which the film was shot, referring to the Algerian putsch, first having heard it on the taxi's radio, then through 2 people discussing it in a cafe, and finally through Antoine, Cleo's romantic interest, telling her about his service in Algeria. Thus the film's events are also told through authorial commentary, as the author of the film, Agnès Varda, contributes to the narrative by including the events of the world during the actual time period of June 21st, 1961, to Cleo's story. The second distinctive narrative feature of French New Wave cinema is reflexivity. As stories and films of the Nouvelle Vague became more loose and unspecified from documenting the social world, the film itself became the only reality the director could claim. Along with young directors' knowledge of the history of their medium, this retreat from documenting the world made film form and style self-referential. Like modern paintings and literature, film became reflexive, pointing to its own materials, structures, and history, says David Bordwell. Although Varda having a decent amount of documenting and objective realism in Cleo, she also follows the narrative style of reflexivity and self-referencing in her film. In Cleo, there is a scene in a projectionist spoof in a cinema. The narrative of this scene is simply about Cleo's friend having to stop by the cinema in order to give her boyfriend some film reels. However, there is a digression from the true story of the film, being about Cleo awaiting her medical results, to a full scene dedicated to a court-métrage, or short film, that is shown in the cinema. The audience get to see this entire short film. In another scene, a sharp eye would notice that there is a reference to Louis Buñuel's 1929 surrealist classic, Un Chien Andalou. which is a poster in the background of one scene. These two examples represent the narrative feature of reflexivity. First, in the projectionist spoof, we see a film within a film, which reflects the medium of filmmaking itself, and acknowledges the actual mechanisms of illusion making, the cinema and the projector. Second, the short silent film that we see stars new wave cinema icons Jean-Luc and Anna Karenina. Thus, not only does this reflect filmmaking, but also references the Nouvelle Vague as well. Finally, a much more subtle reference to cinema itself and to the in-depthness to the history of the medium is the poster of Un Chien Andalou, seen among other posters on a Parisian street wall in the background of one unspecific scene. Un Chien Andalou is a surrealist silent masterpiece, most probably a colossal inspiration to all the Nouvelle Vague directors. The film was directed by Louis Buñuel, who was a prominent figure of the Franco-Spanish cinema, famous for his surreal, sexually explicit and political pictures of the 60s and 70s, starring new wave giants. Thus, due to these two elements of reflexivity in Varda's film, Cleo supports the narrative feature of reflexivity in French New Wave cinema. Open-ended narratives were a pivotal feature of French New Wave cinema. In classic Hollywood, most films would have a clear narrative outcome, such as in Charlie Chaplin's City Lights. The film ends with the blind girl being able to see, and her and the tramp fall in love. However, the Nouvelle Vague, contributing greatly to post-war cinematic modernism, left the endings of its pictures unclear and ambiguous, such as in Truffaut's Les 400 coups, when the film freezes on Antoine Doinel in the foreground of the ocean, after having escaped the child detention facility, leaving the audience wondering about what is next for him, or when Jean-Paul Belmondo dies in the final scene of A Bout de Souffle by Jean-Luc Godard, and the audience are left wondering about the heroine's true feelings towards the hero. Cleo also ends with an open-ended narrative in which Cleo and Antoine are walking together through the hospital gardens, facing the camera in front of them, turning towards each other and smiling, and then they stop and turn towards each other again, and smile again, and then the film ends. We learn that Antoine doesn't want to leave to Algeria anymore, and that Cleo is not afraid anymore, and is happy. The question, as with many other Nouvelle Vague film endings, arises: what now? Will Antoine stay with Cleo, or go back to Algeria? Will Cleo survive her cancer, or will she die? Varda incorporates a perfect open ending into her film, making the viewers ask all these questions. The economic boom after 1958 raised European living standards, which led to the strengthening of trends towards an urban leisure class lifestyle. The outcomes of the economic boom greatly affected the narratives of French New Wave cinema. Films such as L'année dernière à Marienbad by René, or Le Mépris by Godard, La Peau douce by Truffaut, or Pierrot le Fou by Godard, all reflected a leisure class lifestyle. Along with these pictures, Cleo's narrative also features a great amount of the leisure class lifestyle. The idealism and political movements that spread immediately after the Second World War gave way to a more apolitical culture of consumption and leisure, says David Bordwell. First of all, Cleo was a singer with only 3 hit singles, and thus she tries to succeed in her career in order to gain a more leisure-like life. However, although not being incredibly successful in her career, Cleo still tries to gain the most leisure out of the life she has, lying in bed with her cats in an extravagant white mink coat, following the West's trend of consumption by buying a new hat, and constantly checking her beauty. One of the most distinctive stylistic features of French New Wave cinema was the plan séquence, or the sequence shot. This refers to the long take, which is used so much in contemporary Hollywood that it has now become a gimmick. However, in the late 50s and early 60s, in France, the long take was something new and modern. One of the first long takes we see in Cleo is when the protagonist walks out of Madame Irma's, the fortune teller's house, and we track Cleo from a high-angle shot as she walks down the street. This long take symbolizes Cleo's realization and attempt at acceptance that she most probably has cancer, and the plan séquence also gives the film's audiences time to take in this morbid news. Cleo has many long takes, mostly subtle, such as of Cleo and Angel frolicking in Cleo's apartment, and one of Cleo walking around a hat shop, as well as one with the camera in the middle of the back seat row of a taxi showing us the moving street scene, reminding modern viewers of Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris's driving through a futuristic highway. Another effective long take in Cleo, as with the tracking one, is the ending long take. We observe Cleo and Antoine walking towards the audience, with the camera moving forward, and they both contemplate on what to do now, as Cleo has just found out that she does in fact have cancer, and Antoine is not sure whether to leave or stay with Cleo. This long take of the two characters walking is effective in keeping the tension of the narrative, making the audiences as well as the characters be held through the long take at this pensive moment, making both audiences and characters think what to do now. Innovations in equipment was what allowed Nouvelle Vague filmmakers to experiment with these long takes, due to lighter cameras, as well as equipment with other stylistic conventions. During the late 1950s and early 60s, lighter cameras were created that did not need tripods, and reflex viewfinders came along, as well as film stock that produced better exposure in lower light. Although this equipment was designed for documentary filmmakers, fiction directors immediately took advantage of it, being able to film scenes in the streets with lighter cameras, such as in Cleo, quicker and cheaper. Another prevalent stylistic feature of the Nouvelle Vague is the discontinuous editing. Not since the silent era, young directors started to experiment with the power of fragmentary discontinuous editing. David Bordwell says that older directors preferred smooth continuous editing and considered Soviet montage unrealistic and manipulative. In Godard's A Bout de Souffle, Godard cuts bits of the film out of the middle of a sequence, creating jump cuts, disorientating viewers. Although Cleo does have a few very subtle jump cuts, these were most probably done without any profound purpose and simply incorporated due to the need to fix the edit. However, Varda's film makes use of the technique of fragmentary discontinuous editing. After Cleo finds out that she most probably has cancer in the first scene, she walks down the stairs. However, as she is walking down, we see a close-up of her face moving into the camera, repeated 4 times. This editing technique symbolizes Cleo's reluctance to accept her nearby death. Thus, through the repetition of the same shot, Varda makes Cleo want to extend her life, to repeat it, and have more time before she dies. Cleo from 5 to 7, released in 1962, directed by Agnès Varda, is an incredibly inspirational and innovative Nouvelle Vague picture, due to its use of original stylistic and narrative features, and it, along with the entire Nouvelle Vague cinema, proved to be a major contributor to post-war cinematic modernism, inspiring the future of cinema, such as the American New Wave.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this Blumensev Film Talk video. We upload every Friday, usually in our Context and Craft series. However, every so often we'll upload something like this, something different, something to shake things up a little bit. If you enjoyed this video, why don't you give us a like? And hey, maybe subscribe to get more content like this every week.